The morning fog rolled across Fort Hartley in the late summer of 1944, carrying the smell of diesel fuel and rust. Staff Sergeant Margaret Ellen Maggie Caldwell stood at the entrance to Building 7, the main mess hall of the prisoner of war camp, holding a clipboard and watching the sun rise over the Nebraska plains. Her uniform was pressed sharp, her dark hair tucked neatly beneath her regulation cap, and her brown eyes reflected something most people couldn't quite name when they looked at her. Maybe it was determination, or maybe it was the quiet sadness of someone who had learned not to expect much from the world. Maggie had been at Fort Hartley for 9 months. 9 months of running the kitchen, managing supplies, organizing schedules, and doing the work of 2 senior officers without the rank or the pay to match. She had transferred here from Camp Roberts in California, leaving behind a failed engagement and a reputation for being difficult, which, in the military in 1944, usually meant she had opinions and didn't know when to keep her mouth shut. At 32 years old, Maggie was older than most of the female soldiers on base. She had joined the Women's Army Corps in 1942, back when people still thought the war would be over in a few months. Her mother had cried. Her father had said nothing. Her sister had married the pharmacist down the street and had 3 children by the time Maggie got her first promotion. None of them understood why she had chosen the Army over a life in their small town of Fairfield, Missouri. None of them understood that sometimes a woman needs to feel like she is part of something bigger than herself, something that matters. "Good morning, Sergeant Caldwell," a voice called from behind her. It was Private James Henderson, a lanky boy of 19 who had been assigned to help with inventory. His uniform hung on him like it was borrowed from his father. His face still had the softness of someone who had not yet seen combat and probably never would, because he had a heart murmur that had kept him stateside. "Morning, Henderson," Maggie replied, not looking away from the fog. "How are the storage reports looking?" "All in order, ma'am. We're a little low on flour and the canned vegetables are." "I know," Maggie said. She knew everything about the supplies. She could tell you the exact count of potatoes in the basement. She could tell you which trucks were scheduled to arrive and when. She could tell you that they were chronically underfunded, perpetually behind schedule, and that no one in the upper command cared much about the quality of the food or the conditions of the mess hall because it was not their concern. The prisoners ate. The soldiers ate. The books balanced. That was all that mattered. What Maggie did not tell Henderson was that she had spent 3 hours the previous evening rewriting the supply request, trying to find a way to ask for more without appearing ungrateful or difficult. She did not tell him that she had already been called into the commanding officer's office twice for excessive requests, and that she had been warned, in a casual way, but a warning nonetheless, that she was not being a team player. Being a team player, Maggie had learned, meant accepting things as they were. It meant not asking for more than you were given. It meant not pointing out that men ate better food, got better portions, and never had to hear complaints about waste in their mess halls. It meant being grateful that you had a job at all, that you had a uniform, that you had a place in this war effort, even if that place was in the kitchen, out of sight and out of mind. The main gates of Fort Hartley were visible from where Maggie stood. 2 soldiers stood guard there, their rifles held easy at their sides. Beyond the gates, the road stretched out toward the small town of Hartley, Nebraska, a community of about 2,000 people who had grown accustomed to the military presence. Some had learned to profit from it. Others had learned to resent it. Most had learned to simply accept it, the way they accepted the weather. Inside the compound, the prisoner of war camp occupied about 20 acres. A series of barracks, a recreation building, a hospital, and a work detail office. The prisoners, mostly German soldiers in the early months, but now increasingly Japanese soldiers and sailors, were treated according to the Geneva Convention. They received adequate food, adequate shelter, and adequate medical care. They were not mistreated, but they were also not welcome. The town of Hartley had protested their presence with signs and petitions. The families of the soldiers who had died in the Pacific Theater were particularly vocal. How could they accept that these men, these enemies, were being fed, while American boys were dying on islands whose names they could not pronounce? Maggie understood this anger. She also understood that it was pointless. The prisoners were here. They would stay here until the war was over, and it was her job to feed them. She had not wanted this job. When she had first been assigned to Fort Hartley, she had assumed it would be temporary. A few months, maybe a year. She would organize the mess hall, get the system running smoothly, and then transfer to something better, something more important, something that would be noticed. But the months had passed and no transfer had come through. And gradually, Maggie had realized something that took her by surprise. She had become good at this work. She had reorganized the supply chains. She had implemented a new scheduling system. She had worked with the supply sergeant to secure better quality ingredients. The meals had improved. The waste had decreased. Even the prisoners commented on it in the translated reports that came through the command office. None of this had been acknowledged. None of this had been recorded in her file. None of this had resulted in a promotion or a raise or even a simple word of thanks from her commanding officer, Colonel Harrison. Colonel Harrison was a large man with a broad face and the kind of authority that came from a long military career and the assumption that his way was the right way, simply because it was his way. He was fair in a distant sort of way. He was also completely indifferent to Maggie's work. She had become so efficient, so thorough, and so completely self-sufficient that she had made herself invisible. The mess hall ran so smoothly that no one had to think about it. And when no one thinks about you, no one remembers you when opportunities arise. She had been passed over for promotion 3 times. Each time the position had gone to a man with less experience and less success in his role. Each time she had been told that she was too valuable in her current position to be moved. She understood what this meant. It meant that the moment she left, the whole system would collapse, and no one wanted to deal with that inconvenience. So they had decided to simply keep her where she was, making her indispensable and therefore immovable. The fog began to lift as the morning progressed. The sun climbed higher. The compound began to wake up. Soldiers emerged from their barracks. The prisoners began to move toward their work details. And Maggie moved through the mess hall, checking that everything was in place for the breakfast service. The kitchen was her domain. It was also her prison. She knew every corner of it. She knew which stove burned hot on the left side and cool on the right. She knew which pans were thin and which were solid. She knew the names of the 4 cooks who worked under her, and she knew their strengths and their weaknesses. She knew the supply closets and the freezer and the storage room where the flour and sugar and coffee were kept under lock and key. The breakfast that morning was oatmeal, biscuits with a thin gravy and coffee. Nothing special, nothing memorable. But it would be hot and filling, and it would be ready at exactly 6:30 when the first shift of soldiers came through the line. One of her cooks, a woman named Patricia Mills, was cutting biscuits with fast, efficient motions. Patricia was younger than Maggie, maybe 25, and she had the kind of beauty that made people notice her. She also had a way of smiling that made people like her without trying. She had been transferred to Fort Hartley just 4 months ago, and in that time she had already been invited to 3 dances at the town's community center and had been noticed by at least 2 officers. "You doing okay, Sarge?" Patricia asked, glancing up from her work. "Fine," Maggie said. "How are the biscuits?" "Good. These should be ready to go in the oven in about 5 minutes." Maggie nodded and moved on. She did not ask Patricia about the dances or the officers. She did not ask her about the life outside the mess hall that Patricia had somehow managed to create, the social life that seemed to come naturally to her. Maggie had stopped expecting that kind of life a long time ago. She had stopped thinking that being good at what you did would lead to recognition or reward or anything beyond the simple satisfaction of knowing that you had done your job well. By noon, the breakfast service was done. The lunch preparations were well underway, and Maggie was in Colonel Harrison's office, being called in for what she assumed would be another routine meeting about inventory. She was wrong. Colonel Harrison sat behind his desk, his face serious. Next to him stood Captain Morris, the camp's administrative officer, a thin man with nervous eyes and a tendency to speak in a rapid, clipped manner. "Sergeant Caldwell," Colonel Harrison said, not looking up from the papers in front of him, "we have a situation." Maggie stood at attention. She had learned long ago not to speak unless asked directly. "The prisoners we're receiving next week," Captain Morris said, speaking very quickly, "include a number of high-ranking Japanese officers. The Tokyo government has made a formal request through the Red Cross that these men be treated with certain considerations. Food considerations." Maggie waited. "They're requesting," Colonel Harrison said, finally looking at her, "that the prisoners receive meals that are more in line with their cultural traditions. Japanese food. They claim that the prisoners are suffering psychologically from being unable to eat familiar meals, and that this is affecting their morale." Maggie thought about this. The prisoners received the same meals as the soldiers, minus the coffee and spirits. The food was adequate. It was not luxury, but it was not starvation either. "The command has decided," Captain Morris continued, speaking even faster, "that we should accommodate this request as a goodwill gesture, to show that we are civilized, that we understand that war does not require us to lose our humanity." Maggie understood what was really happening here. This was not about humanity. This was about politics. This was about the government showing the world, specifically the Japanese government, that they were reasonable people, that they treated prisoners well, that they were not barbarians. "We need you to design a menu," Colonel Harrison said. "Something that incorporates Japanese food preferences but using the supplies we have available. Something that is economical. Something that demonstrates our commitment to proper treatment while not breaking our budget." There was a long silence in the office. "Yes, sir," Maggie said. "I'll need information about Japanese cuisine. I'll need to research what ingredients we can source. I'll need time." "You have 1 week," Colonel Harrison said. "The prisoners arrive next Tuesday." Maggie left the office in a state of quiet shock. 1 week to design an entirely new menu for a cuisine she had never cooked before, using ingredients she had never worked with, for men who were the enemy. Men who had killed American soldiers. Men whose country had bombed American ships and started this entire war. She did not think about the irony of the assignment, that she had spent 9 months being told her work did not matter, that she was just doing the job she was assigned, with no recognition or reward. And now, suddenly, her skills were needed for something that had become a political matter. Now they wanted her to care. Now they wanted her to work miracles. She should have refused. She should have found some reason why this was impossible. She should have pointed out that she was already running the mess hall at full capacity, and adding another project would mean sacrificing something else. Instead, she said yes. Because that was what Maggie did. She said yes. She worked harder. She found a way. She made things happen even when the system was designed to keep her in her place. The Fort Hartley Post Library was a small room in Building 3, containing perhaps 500 books. The librarian was a civilian, a woman named Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, who was in her 60s and had been living in Nebraska her entire life. She had worked at the library in town before the war, and she had volunteered to organize the Post Library when it was established 3 years ago. Maggie found her there on Tuesday afternoon, sitting at a small desk with a stack of index cards in front of her. "Mrs. Thompson," Maggie said, "I need your help." Eleanor looked up and her face brightened. Most people did not come to the library looking for Eleanor. Most people found books and left. Maggie's request for help for her expertise seemed to genuinely please her. "Of course, dear, what do you need?" "Japanese cuisine," Maggie said. "Everything you have about it. And if you don't have much, I need to know if there's a way to get more information from the town library or from anywhere else." Eleanor's eyes widened. "Japanese cuisine, whatever for." Maggie explained the situation. As she talked, she watched Eleanor's expression change from curiosity to something more complex, a mixture of understanding and concern. "Well," Eleanor said when Maggie finished, "I don't have much here. We have a few cultural books that might have some information, but I have a better idea. There's a woman in town, Mrs. Yuki Tanaka. She's been living in Nebraska for about 15 years. Her husband is a farmer. They came before all this unpleasantness." Eleanor paused, choosing her words carefully. "She's had to be very careful since Pearl Harbor. People have been unkind, but she might be willing to help you. If anyone knows about Japanese food, it would be her." Is she American?" Maggie asked, immediately feeling foolish for the question. "She's been naturalized for 10 years, Eleanor said. "Her husband is American. They have 2 children who are born here. They're as American as anyone else, though you wouldn't know it by the way some folks treat them." Eleanor gave Maggie the address and directions to the Tanaka family home. It was about 2 miles outside of town, on a small farm. The drive there took Maggie about 20 minutes in the post truck that she had signed out on the pretext of picking up supplies. The Tanaka farm was modest but well-maintained. There was a red barn and a farmhouse with white trim. The fields around it showed the golden green of late summer crops. Everything was neat and ordered in a way that Maggie appreciated. Mrs. Yuki Tanaka was working in a garden behind the house when Maggie arrived. She was a small woman, probably in her late 50s, with gray streaking her black hair. She wore a simple house dress and an apron, and she was gathering vegetables into a basket. When she saw the truck and the uniformed woman emerging from it, her body went still. Maggie saw fear cross her face, and for a moment she understood something about the war that she had not fully understood before. The war was not just fought on distant islands. It was also fought here, at home, in the hearts of people who were simply trying to live their lives. "Mrs. Tanaka," Maggie called out as she approached. Yes, the woman replied, her voice small and careful. My name is Margaret Caldwell. I'm a staff sergeant at Fort Hartley. Mrs. Thompson at the library suggested I might speak with you. I need your help with something. Maggie explained the situation. She watched as Mrs. Tanaka's fear gradually transformed into something else. Maybe skepticism, maybe hope, maybe just confusion. You want me to teach you about Japanese food? Mrs. Tanaka asked slowly. For the prisoners. Yes, Maggie said. I have 1 week. I need to create a menu that incorporates Japanese cuisine using ingredients we can get here in Nebraska. I don't know anything about Japanese cooking, and I don't have time to learn through books alone. I need someone who understands the food and the culture. Mrs. Tanaka was quiet for a long moment. She set down her basket of vegetables carefully. Why are you doing this? She asked. Why does a soldier care about prisoners eating good food? It was a direct question, and Maggie respected it enough to give it an honest answer. I don't know, Maggie said. Maybe because I was told to do something and I do what I'm told. Or maybe because I think that even prisoners deserve to be treated like human beings. Or maybe because it's a challenge and I like solving problems. The truth is, I'm not sure. But I know I'm going to do it, and I know I need your help to do it well. Something in Maggie's answer seemed to matter to Mrs. Tanaka. She picked up her basket of vegetables again. Come inside, she said. We'll talk about Japanese food, and you can tell me more about what you're trying to do. The Tanaka kitchen was warm and simple. There were pots and pans hanging on the walls, and the smell of cooking, garlic and soy and ginger, filled the air. There were jars of things that Maggie did not recognize, with labels in Japanese characters. Mrs. Tanaka set about making tea while she talked. Japanese food is built on simple things, Mrs. Tanaka said, settling at the kitchen table with Maggie. Rice is the center of every meal. We also use soy sauce, which comes from soybeans. We use miso, which is fermented soybean paste. We use seaweed, which we would get from the ocean, but you can substitute with other things. We use fish and shellfish, but we also use vegetables and grains. She began to describe dishes, simple things really when you got down to it. Rice bowls with pickled vegetables, soups made with broth and vegetables, noodles with sauce. Things that, when explained, did not sound impossible to replicate with American ingredients. The important thing, Mrs. Tanaka said, is not the exact ingredients. It's the intention, it's the respect. When you cook something for someone, you are saying something with that food. You are saying whether you think they are worth the effort. You are saying whether you see them as human beings or not. That is what matters. Maggie understood. She had always understood this, even if she had never put it into words. This was why she cared about the quality of the food in her mess hall, even though no one else seemed to care. Because the food was a message. It was a statement about how much she valued the people she was feeding. Over the next few hours, Mrs. Tanaka taught Maggie about Japanese cooking. She showed her how to make a simple miso soup. She explained the importance of balance in Japanese meals, the way flavors and textures were arranged to complement each other. She told her about rice, which was the foundation of every meal, and about the various dishes that could be built around it. By the time Maggie left the Tanaka farm, it was almost dark. She had pages of notes, several jars of ingredients that Mrs. Tanaka had insisted she take, and a new understanding of what she was about to undertake. When she returned to Fort Hartley, she went directly to the mess hall kitchen. Patricia Mills was there, closing up after the dinner service. Maggie, where have you been? Patricia asked. You missed the staff meeting. I was researching, Maggie said. For the new menu project, Patricia, how do you feel about learning to cook Japanese food? Patricia laughed. Japanese food? Maggie, this is Nebraska. Where are we going to get Japanese ingredients? We're going to get creative, Maggie said. She set the jars on the counter. Starting tomorrow, we're going to be experimenting. I need you and the other cooks to help me. Over the next few days, Maggie began to redesign the mess hall's approach to the upcoming prisoners. She created a basic menu that incorporated rice as the centerpiece of meals, using the supply channels she had already established to source ingredients. Seaweed from suppliers who normally sent it to health food stores, soy sauce from a distributor in Kansas City, and various vegetables that could be prepared in Japanese styles. She also prepared herself for the resistance. It came, as she had known it would, from multiple directions. The first challenge came from her own cooks. When Maggie announced that they would be making miso soup and rice and pickled vegetables, One of them, a man named Sergeant Bill Crawford, actually laughed out loud. "You want us to make Japanese food," he said. "These are the people who killed our boys in the Pacific, and you want us to cook for them like they're honored guests." "They're prisoners," Maggie said, keeping her voice even. "And Colonel Harrison has ordered that we accommodate their food preferences. We have our orders, and we're going to follow them." "This is wrong," Crawford said. "It's un-American. It's betraying the men who died." "No," Maggie said quietly. "It's treating human beings like human beings. It's showing that we're better than they are because we don't need to repay cruelty with cruelty. That's what being American means to me." She did not expect Crawford to understand. She was, however, expecting her commanding officer to support her. This is where she was wrong. Colonel Harrison called her into his office on Thursday afternoon. His face was troubled. "Sergeant Caldwell," he said, "I'm hearing some concerns from the men about the new meal plan. Some of them feel that providing Japanese-style meals is inappropriate, given the current state of the war and the losses we've suffered." Maggie stood at attention. She chose her words very carefully. "Sir, I was assigned to develop a menu that incorporates Japanese cuisine using available resources. I have done exactly that. The menu I've created is economical, nutritious, and designed to address the prisoners' stated needs. If there are men on this base who disagree with this assignment, the issue is not with my work. The issue is with the assignment itself, which came from you and Captain Morris." Colonel Harrison flinched slightly at this observation. His face reddened. "I don't appreciate your tone, Sergeant," he said coldly. "What I appreciate is efficiency and obedience. You seem to be capable of one but not consistently capable of the other." "Yes, sir," Maggie said. She said nothing more. "The prisoners arrive on Tuesday," Colonel Harrison continued. "Your menu will be implemented as scheduled. However, I'm warning you, Sergeant. If this becomes a morale problem for the men, if I hear one more complaint, if this causes any disruption whatsoever, there will be consequences. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Maggie said. But as she left his office, she understood something else. She understood that the moment anything went wrong, she would be blamed. The moment a soldier complained about eating Japanese food, she would be at fault. The moment there was a headline in the local paper about feeding prisoners luxury meals, she would be the scapegoat. They had assigned her an impossible task, and they were already preparing to crucify her when she failed. She had two choices. She could fail spectacularly, do a bad job, and blame it on the resources available or the complexity of the task. Or she could succeed brilliantly and hope that success would protect her from blame. The 23 Japanese prisoners arrived on Tuesday morning in a convoy of trucks. Maggie watched from a window in the mess hall as they were escorted through the gates by armed guards. They were thin men, mostly, with the kind of weariness that came from months at sea and then months in military custody. They wore the standard prisoner-of-war camp uniforms, but several of them had insignia indicating that they were officers. The men among them appeared to be in their 30s and 40s, with weathered faces and serious expressions. The American soldiers who escorted them watched with undisguised hostility. These were the enemy. These were the men who had killed their brothers and their friends. Maggie's stomach was tight with anxiety. Everything depended on the next few hours. The breakfast service that morning had been standard: oatmeal, biscuits, coffee. The prisoners had eaten in a separate section of the mess hall under guard. There had been no trouble. Now, as the afternoon progressed and preparations began for the first dinner service, Maggie stood in the kitchen and went over the menu one more time. Rice, miso soup with vegetables and tofu, steamed fish with a ginger sauce, pickled vegetables, green tea. It was simple, it was respectful, it was the best she could do with the resources available. Patricia came to stand beside her, wiping her hands on her apron. "You nervous?" Patricia asked. "Yes," Maggie admitted. "If this goes wrong, if the prisoners don't like the food, or if the men on base start complaining, I'm going to be held responsible." "And if it goes right?" Patricia asked. "Then nobody will notice," Maggie said. "It will just be the way things are supposed to be." Patricia squeezed her arm. "Well, let's make it go right." The dinner service began at 6 o'clock. The prisoners were escorted in, and they moved through the line where the food was being served. Maggie stood in the kitchen, watching through the serving window, unable to eat or sit or do anything but stand there and wait to see what would happen. The first man took his tray. He looked at the rice, at the soup, at the fish. His face showed no expression. He moved through the line and sat down at one of the tables. The next man did the same, and the next and the next. Maggie could see them looking at the food, could see them examining it, could see them setting it down in front of them and simply staring at it for a moment, as if they could not quite believe that it was real. Then very slowly, one of the officers, a man with a scar along his left jaw, picked up his chopsticks. Maggie had insisted on providing chopsticks, which had cost her a favor from the supply sergeant and several hours of investigation to locate, and began to eat. He took a spoonful of the soup. He paused, and then very slowly tears began to run down his face. He was not the only one. Over the next few minutes, Maggie watched as several of the men began to cry quietly as they ate. Not dramatic tears, not sobs, just quiet tears running down their faces as they ate food that tasted like home. One man, younger than the others, maybe in his mid-20s, set down his chopsticks after just a few bites and put his head in his hands. A guard moved toward him, but another prisoner, one of the officers, shook his head slightly, and the guard backed away. In the kitchen, nobody spoke. Patricia's eyes were wide. Even Sergeant Crawford, who had been so vocal in his opposition, stood silently, watching through the serving window. "This is what food is supposed to do," Maggie heard herself say quietly. "It's supposed to bring people back to themselves. It's supposed to remind them of home. Even prisoners deserve that." The meal was eaten in near-total silence. The men ate slowly, as if they wanted to make it last. Some of them asked for seconds, a request Maggie had approved in advance. Some of them ate every grain of rice, every bit of fish, every vegetable. When they were finished, the prisoners were escorted back to their barracks, and then the kitchen was quiet again. Maggie realized she was shaking. Over the next few days, something unexpected happened. The prisoners began to thrive. Their faces became less gaunt. Their bearing became straighter. The camp commander reported that they were more cooperative, more willing to work, less likely to cause trouble. They were still prisoners. They were still enemies, but something in them had been acknowledged and respected, and it had changed something fundamental. The American soldiers at the base, however, reacted differently than Maggie had anticipated. Instead of complaining about the Japanese prisoners getting good food, they started asking for similar meals. They started requesting rice bowls instead of their standard rations. They started asking about the pickled vegetables and the ginger sauce. Patricia came to Maggie one morning with a piece of the local newspaper. "You should see this," she said. The article was titled, "Fort Hartley's Humane Approach to Enemy Prisoners Praised by Geneva Convention Representative." It described how the camp commander had recently received a letter from a representative of the International Red Cross, complimenting Fort Hartley on its adherence to the Geneva Convention protocols and its respectful treatment of prisoners. The article specifically mentioned the food service, noting that meals were culturally appropriate and that the prisoners appeared to be in good psychological health. There was no mention of Maggie by name, but there was a quote from Colonel Harrison about his commitment to proper procedures and humane treatment. Maggie read the article twice, then set it down. "Well," she said, "at least someone noticed." But she was wrong. Someone else had noticed. 3 weeks after the first Japanese prisoner meal service, Maggie received a visitor in the mess hall kitchen. It was a woman, maybe in her 50s, dressed in a nice coat and a hat. She was accompanied by Captain Morris, who looked nervous. "Sergeant Caldwell," Captain Morris said, "this is Mrs. Helen Whitmore. She's a journalist with the Lincoln Star newspaper. She would like to speak with you about the prisoner meal program." Maggie's first instinct was to refuse. Talking to journalists was above her pay grade. But something in the woman's face, something that looked like genuine curiosity rather than judgment, made her change her mind. They sat in the small office attached to the mess hall. Mrs. Whitmore pulled out a notebook and a pencil. "Tell me about the meal program," Mrs. Whitmore said. "How did it come about? What made you decide to incorporate Japanese cuisine?" "I was given an assignment," Maggie said carefully, "to design meals that would accommodate the prisoners' cultural preferences. That's what I did." "But there must have been resistance," Mrs. Whitmore pressed. "There are always people who believe that prisoners don't deserve special treatment." Maggie considered how to answer this. She decided on the truth. Yes, there was resistance. Some people thought it was wrong to feed the prisoners good food when American soldiers had died in the Pacific. Some people thought it was un-American. Some people thought it was a waste of resources. "And what do you think?" Mrs. Whitmore asked. "I think that prisoners are human beings," Maggie said. "I think that how we treat the people we have power over says something about who we are as a nation. I think that being victorious doesn't mean we have to be cruel. And I think that a good meal is one of the most basic ways we have to show respect for another person's humanity." Mrs. Whitmore wrote this down, word for word. "Have you received any recognition for this work?" Mrs. Whitmore asked. The question hung in the air. Maggie knew that this was important. She knew that how she answered could matter, but she also knew that it was important to be honest. "No," Maggie said. "I haven't, and I don't expect to. I did what I was assigned to do as well as I could. That's my job." "But that doesn't seem right," Mrs. Whitmore said, looking genuinely troubled. "You've done something remarkable. You've created a program that's being praised by the International Red Cross. You've improved the morale of both the prisoners and the soldiers on this base. You've shown a level of compassion and creativity that is rare in the military. And yet—" She trailed off, but Maggie understood what she was saying. "And yet no one has acknowledged it. And yet you've been passed over for promotion. And yet you continue to do excellent work knowing that your excellence will be taken for granted." "That's the way it works for women in the military," Maggie said quietly. "We do the work, we do it well, and then we're invisible." When Mrs. Whitmore left, Maggie did not know what to expect. She had learned not to expect much. October came to Nebraska, bringing with it crisp mornings and the end of summer. The leaves on the few trees around Fort Hartley turned gold and red and fell to the ground. The Japanese prisoner meal program had become routine by now. The men ate their rice and their soup and their fish, and the soldiers on the base had grown accustomed to the sight of it. Some had even started to look forward to the occasional Japanese-style meals that Maggie had begun to incorporate into the broader mess hall menus. The article in the Lincoln Star newspaper had been published, with the headline, "Woman Sergeant Brings Humanity to War." It was a nice article. Maggie's name was in it. Her photo was in it, in her uniform, standing in the kitchen of the mess hall. Her mother had called from Fairfield, Missouri, and read it to her over the phone. Her sister had sent her a copy, cut out from where someone at her husband's pharmacy had posted it on a bulletin board. But the recognition, when it came from an unexpected place. There was a man named Captain James Fisher. He was the camp's medical officer, a man in his early 40s who had been a surgeon before the war. He was serious, competent, and respected. He had no reason to notice Maggie in any particular way. They moved in different circles. They did not see each other regularly. But one afternoon, he came to the mess hall and asked to speak with her. "I wanted to thank you," Captain Fisher said, "for what you've done for the prisoners. Specifically, I wanted to thank you for what it's done for their health." They were standing in the kitchen, and Maggie looked at him with some confusion. "I don't understand," she said. "When they first arrived," Captain Fisher explained, "several of the men were showing signs of severe depression. One of them had tried to harm himself. They were losing weight even though they were eating regularly. The psychological toll of being far from home in a foreign land treated as the enemy was very severe." He paused and Maggie listened. "Since you implemented the Japanese meal program," he continued, "I have seen a marked improvement in their psychological condition. They're eating better. They're gaining weight. They're less aggressive, less withdrawn. They're more cooperative with the medical staff. I've watched men come back from the edge of complete despair simply because they were fed food that tasted like home." Captain Fisher's eyes were serious. "What you've done is important," he said. "It's important for the prisoners, and it's important for all of us. It's a reminder that even in war, even when we're fighting enemies, we don't have to abandon our humanity. Thank you." After he left, Maggie sat down in the small office and cried. She did not cry often. She did not allow herself to feel too much, because feeling too much was dangerous in the military. But she cried then because someone had noticed what she had done and someone had taken the time to tell her that it mattered. The newspaper article, it turned out, had consequences that Maggie had not anticipated. 3 weeks after it was published, there was a letter in the mail for her. It was from the War Department in Washington, D.C. She was being considered for a position with a special task force that was being formed to handle humanitarian issues in prisoner-of-war camps across the country. The position would be a promotion, first lieutenant, with a significant increase in pay and responsibility. They wanted to know if she was interested. Maggie read the letter 3 times before she could quite believe it was real. She went to Colonel Harrison to ask his permission to accept the position. She expected him to be pleased. This would be a good reflection on the base, after all. This would show that Fort Hartley was producing excellence and innovation. Instead, she found him angry. "I see you've been talking to journalists," he said coldly. "Sir, I was approached by—" "I know exactly what happened," he cut her off. "You gave an interview to a newspaper, and somehow this resulted in the War Department noticing you and offering you a promotion. A promotion that you earned by doing the very work you were assigned to do here, at this base, under my command." Maggie said nothing. She had learned that when men were angry, sometimes the best thing to do was simply let them be angry. "You know what this looks like," Colonel Harrison continued. "It looks like you've been going around me. It looks like you've been seeking attention and glory instead of simply doing your job. It looks like you don't understand your place in the chain of command." "Sir, I didn't seek out the journalist. She came to me and Captain Morris was there, so I—" "I don't care," Colonel Harrison said. "And frankly, I'm not happy about losing you. This program has become an important part of the base's operations, and now I'm going to have to find someone to replace you. Someone who will not be as competent, someone who will let things slide. Do you understand what you're doing?" Maggie understood perfectly. She was being made to feel guilty for succeeding. She was being made to feel like she was abandoning her responsibilities by accepting a promotion. She was being manipulated with concern and obligation. And she almost fell for it. That night she did not sleep. She lay in her bunk in the barracks that housed the female officers and non-commissioned officers, and she thought about the position in Washington. She thought about the chance to make an even larger difference, to influence policy across multiple camps, to have her work recognized and acknowledged on a national level. She thought about staying, about accepting her punishment for being noticed, about accepting Colonel Harrison's assertion that she was being selfish by leaving. At 3 in the morning, she got up and went to the kitchen. She made tea, American tea, not the green tea that Mrs. Tanaka had taught her about, and she sat at one of the tables and thought about her entire life. She had always been the one who did what was expected, the one who made things work, the one who put everyone else's needs before her own. She had sacrificed a relationship. She had sacrificed a normal life. She had sacrificed recognition and acknowledgement over and over because she had believed that if she just worked hard enough, if she just did her job well enough, that somehow it would all be worth something. But it had never been worth anything, until now. Until someone outside the system had noticed what she had done, and the system had been forced to acknowledge her value. And now she was considering giving that up, because a man she worked for was angry and disappointed. Mrs. Tanaka had told her something during one of their cooking sessions. She had said, "In Japan, we have a concept called gammon. It means to endure, to persist through hardship without complaint. It's a virtue. But sometimes gammon becomes just acceptance of injustice. Sometimes it becomes a kind of cowardice dressed up as honor." 2 days before she was scheduled to leave Fort Hartley for her new assignment in Washington, Maggie received another visitor. It was the same journalist, Mrs. Helen Whitmore, but this time she came with something different in her expression. She looked worried. She also looked angry. "I need to show you something," Mrs. Whitmore said, and she pulled out a document. It was a memo, stamped confidential, from Colonel Harrison to the War Department. It was dated 3 weeks earlier, just a few days after the newspaper article was published. Maggie began to read, and with each word her heart sank. The memo outlined the problems with the Japanese prisoner meal program. It stated that it was creating resentment among the American soldiers, that it was wasting valuable resources, that it was setting a dangerous precedent, and that it was being handled by an officer who is more interested in publicity than in actual military operations. The memo went on to say that while the program was technically following the Geneva Convention protocols, it was excessive in its approach and should be scaled back to more appropriate levels. Most damaging of all, the memo explicitly stated that while Sergeant Caldwell had been assigned to develop the meal program, the actual success of the program was due to the oversight and guidance of the commanding officer, and that she should not be overestimated as a factor in its achievement. "Where did you get this?" Maggie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have a source at the War Department," Mrs. Whitmore said. "Someone who believes that officers like Colonel Harrison need to be held accountable for taking credit for the work of others. Specifically, for taking credit for the work of women who have no voice to speak up for themselves." Maggie read the memo again, trying to make sense of it. This was a man admitting, in writing, that he was going to try to diminish her contribution to a program that had worked well and had been recognized nationally. "What do you want me to do?" Maggie asked. "I want to publish this," Mrs. Whitmore said. "I want to tell the story of how a woman officer created an innovative program, how it succeeded, how it was recognized by the War Department, and how her commanding officer tried to diminish her contribution and take credit for her work. I want people to know about this, because this is what happens to women in the military every single day." Maggie felt something shift inside her. This was her chance. This was her chance to expose Colonel Harrison, to make him look bad, to get revenge for the way he had treated her. But it was also her chance to damage the meal program. If she authorized the publication of this memo, if she allowed herself to be used in a story that made Colonel Harrison look corrupt, there would be consequences. The base would be in an uproar. The prisoners might be punished. The meal program might be shut down. Everything that she had worked so hard to build might collapse. "I need to think about this," Maggie said. That night, she called a meeting with Captain Fisher and Captain Morris. They met in the office of the mess hall after the dinner service had ended. "I've been offered a position in Washington," Maggie told them. "And I've been given the opportunity to either accept the position quietly or to speak out about how my work has been credited to Colonel Harrison in some official documents." She showed them the memo. Both men read it carefully. Captain Morris's face turned red with anger. Captain Fisher's expression became even more serious. "This is not right," Captain Morris said. "This is dishonesty. This is a breach of military ethics." "It's also something that happens all the time," Captain Fisher said quietly. "Men take credit for women's work. It's not right, but it happens." "So what do I do?" Maggie asked. The two men looked at each other. "You have three choices," Captain Fisher said. "First, you can accept the position in Washington and say nothing. You'll get the recognition from the War Department and you'll move forward with your career. But the record will show that Colonel Harrison was responsible for this program's success. Second, you can expose the memo to the press. You'll damage Colonel Harrison, but you'll also damage the base and potentially damage the meal program that you've worked so hard to build. Or third, you can find a third way, something that protects both the program and the truth." "What would that be?" Maggie asked. It was Captain Morris who answered. "Write a report," he said. "A formal military report for the record detailing exactly what happened, exactly who did what. Make it official, make it part of the military record. That way it's not just a newspaper story, it's the official truth. And later, when people look back at what happened, they'll find your report and they'll know what really happened." Maggie understood. This was a way to protect the truth without creating a scandal. It was a way to make sure that the record was accurate, even if most people never looked at it. "Will that be enough?" Maggie asked. "Maybe not in the immediate future," Captain Fisher said. "But the truth has a way of surfacing eventually, and having it in the official record means that someday someone will find it and they will know that you did this work and you did it well and you were not properly acknowledged for it at the time. That matters." Maggie spent that night writing the report. She documented everything: the assignment from Colonel Harrison, her research with Mrs. Tanaka, the development of the menu, the resistance she had faced, the results, the recognition from the International Red Cross. She included quotes from the various people involved. She included the newspaper article. She attached copies of the menu and the supply requests and everything else that could serve as evidence of what had actually happened. It was a thick document, probably 30 pages, written in clear military language. When she was done, she made 3 copies. One she submitted to Captain Fisher to be filed in the medical records, where it might not be noticed or read, but would be there if anyone ever decided to look. One she gave to Captain Morris to be filed in the administrative records, and one she kept for herself. Then she went to see Mrs. Whitmore. "Don't publish it," Maggie told the journalist. "I'm asking you not to publish the memo or the story, at least not yet. I need to accept this promotion and move forward with my career. But I wanted you to know what happened. I wanted you to know the truth." "But people should know," Mrs. Whitmore protested. "People should know what happened to you." "People will know," Maggie said. "Maybe not now, maybe not for years, but the truth is in the record now. It's official, and that's enough for me." 15 years later, in 1959, there was a quiet ceremony in Washington, D.C. It was a gathering of officers who had served in prisoner-of-war camps during the Second World War. They were being honored for their service, and the War Department was publishing a comprehensive history of the camps and the policies that had governed them. Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Ellen Caldwell. She had been promoted again and again, working her way up through the ranks, stood in a government building and watched as various officers and administrators were recognized for their contributions to the war effort. Colonel Harrison was there. He had retired from the military 5 years earlier and had written a book about his experiences commanding Fort Hartley. The book had been moderately successful. In it, he had described the Japanese prisoner meal program as one of his innovations, something he had implemented to maintain good morale and adhere to the Geneva Convention. The book had not mentioned Maggie's name, not once. When the official history was released, though, things were different. A researcher had gone through the military archives, looking for the origins of various policies. She had found Maggie's report. She had cross-referenced it with the newspaper article and with Captain Fisher's medical records and with everything else that Maggie had carefully documented. The official history included a whole section on the prisoner meal program at Fort Hartley. It gave Maggie full credit for developing the program. It documented the challenges she had faced. It included quotes from Mrs. Tanaka, who was still alive and had been interviewed by the researcher. It included the fact that the International Red Cross had specifically commended the program's implementation and the humanitarian approach it represented. It also included Colonel Harrison's memo, the one in which he tried to minimize Maggie's contribution and claim credit for himself. Colonel Harrison, standing in that government building in 1959, had to watch as history was set straight. He had to stand there while the official record was read aloud, and his attempted theft of credit was exposed, not as a scandal, but simply as a historical fact that was being corrected. Maggie did not gloat. She was not the kind of person who gloated, but she felt something settle inside her, something that had been unsettled for a long time. Justice, maybe, or maybe just the simple satisfaction of knowing that the truth had survived even when powerful people had tried to bury it. After the ceremony, Mrs. Tanaka came to see her. She was much older now, in her 70s, but her eyes were still bright. "I read what they said about us," Mrs. Tanaka said in her gentle way. "About the cooking, about what the food meant to the men. Thank you for making sure people knew that I helped." "You did more than help," Maggie said. "You made it possible. You gave the program its heart. Without you, it would have just been food." "No," Mrs. Tanaka said. "You gave it its heart. I just helped you put it on a plate." They had tea together, the Japanese tea that Maggie had never forgotten how to make. And they talked about the war, and about the men who had eaten their meals in that mess hall in Nebraska so many years ago, and about how sometimes the small acts of kindness matter more than anyone knows at the time. Maggie had had a long career. She had risen to the rank of full colonel, which had been remarkable for a woman in the military. She had implemented humanitarian policies across a dozen different prisoner-of-war camps. She had influenced the way the military treated prisoners, even in the decades after the war. She had never been famous. Her name would not appear in most history books. But the policies she had developed, the standards she had set, the belief that prisoners deserved to be treated as human beings, these things persisted. These things changed the way the military operated. And it had all started because she had been given an assignment that no one thought was important, and she had decided to do it right. In her final years, Colonel Margaret Ellen Caldwell was interviewed by a historian who was writing a book about women in the military during the Second World War. She spoke about her years at Fort Hartley, about developing the meal program, about the resistance she had faced, and about what she had learned from the experience. "The thing I learned," she said, speaking slowly and carefully the way elderly people sometimes do, "was that it doesn't matter if you're recognized for what you do. It doesn't matter if you get promoted or praised or thanked. What matters is that you do the right thing, and you do it as well as you possibly can, because even if no one notices at the time, even if it takes years or decades or a lifetime, the truth has a way of rising to the surface. The right action has a way of leading to other right actions. One meal that says you recognize another person's humanity can change that person's entire trajectory. It can save them. It can remind them that they are worth something, even in war, even when they are treated as the enemy." I never knew if the men in that camp remembered eating those meals. I never knew if it really made a difference in their lives, but I know it made a difference to me. It changed who I was as a person. It changed what I believed was possible, and in the end, that changed everything. Colonel Caldwell passed away in 1983 at the age of 70. The New York Times obituary mentioned her contributions to military policy and her work advocating for humanitarian treatment of prisoners. It was a modest obituary, not the kind that makes headlines, but it was there in the record for anyone who cared to look. In Fort Hartley, Nebraska, which had grown into a larger town but still maintained its military base, there is a plaque in the mess hall where Maggie once worked. It reads, "In honor of Staff Sergeant Margaret Ellen Caldwell, who demonstrated that true strength lies not in the power we hold over others, but in the compassion we extend to them." Her work to provide culturally appropriate meals to prisoners of war established a standard of humanitarian treatment that influenced military policy for decades to come. In 1944, this mess hall became a place where enemies were fed with respect. In 1959, the world acknowledged that she had shown us the way. Every prisoner who ate those meals, every soldier who saw them being served, every officer who witnessed what was possible when you treated people like human beings, they all became part of a story that continued long after the war was over. They all became part of a larger understanding that in our darkest moments, when we are at war with our enemies, when we are afraid and angry and grieving, the most revolutionary act is to choose kindness, to choose to feed someone well, to choose to acknowledge their humanity. That is what Maggie did. That is what she was remembered for, not for any great victory in battle or any dramatic, heroic moment, but for the simple, profound decision to do one thing well, to treat people like they mattered, even when the entire system was telling her that they did not.